call Dr Megan Woods.
Thank you, Mr Speaker, and it's my pleasure to take a call on this bill and set out again why Labor cannot support this piece of legislation. I would like to acknowledge the work in the Select Committee. If this was the Academy Awards, I think you'd be handing out an award for courage under fire for the government members of the Select Committee who had to sit there after submitter after submitter from ITO and the Industry Training Federation and the Contractors Federation, agreeing with the CTU, all traipsed in, one after the other, and consistently told the government members of this committee exactly what was wrong with this legislation and how it was not going to work, how it is not going to fulfil the aims and the purpose of what we need in New Zealand about putting strong and coherent legislation around how it is that we fulfil one of the most important tasks of ensuring we have a trained and skilled workforce that is fit for purpose to work in New Zealand jobs. This bill simply is not going to do that. The government members of the committee were told time and time again, but Mr Speaker, the tragedy is these messengers did not get through. The government was simply not willing to listen. Government members were arrogant and out of touch. They knew best about what was going to work. Doesn't matter the industry are coming up and telling you, no, I'm sorry, what you're saying isn't going to work. This isn't going to be fit for purpose for how it is that we train apprentices. So to hear government members of the committee, like the previous speaker, describe this as a collegial environment is somewhat surprising. I guess collegial and all the submitters agreed. They agreed that this bill won't achieve its aims. But government members sat there, they hardly asked a question because they knew that the legislation that they were hearing at the committee and that they were going to have to bring back to this House simply would not work. And what was it that government members were told about this legislation? When submitters came up, it was very much what the other members of the committee also thought. First of all, that this legislation is nothing but a continuation of this government's privatisation agenda within the education, skills and training sector. We've seen it with charter schools. We've seen it with public-private partnerships in our secondary education system. We've seen it with the competitive tendering of level 1 and 2 qualifications within our polytechnic system, and now we're seeing it within our industry training system, Mr Speaker. That what we're seeing is that agencies other than ITOs are going to be eligible for direct funding from government to fulfil the training requirements. Mr Speaker, this is not what is going to achieve the aims. It allows these organisations to get the direct funding, and we see this as nothing short of an ideological commitment from this government to make sure that they privatise every bit of our education system that they can get their hands on. And it is this ideological blinkeredness that meant that government members of that committee sat there and had to listen to submitter after submitter tell them how just giving money out willy-nilly without some kind of more strategic approach to this was not going to fulfil the aims of what was needed for industry training in this country. Other speakers have talked about the other problem that was major problem that stops us in Labor from being able to vote for this legislation is the removal of the skills leadership function from ITOs. ITOs are not simply organisations that are put there to channel funding through and to come up with standards. That we think that actually there is a really important leadership function for ITOs and what they can do for industry in New Zealand. And other speakers before me have talked about the impact this will have on small and medium-sized enterprises, which a number of organisations which are wanting to undertake industry training actually fall into that category. Another element that was brought up is that the changes contained with this legislation are going to water down the ability for the pastoral care within industry training and within our apprenticeship system. And Mr Speaker, pastoral care and the ability to deliver pastoral care are an absolutely critical part of any successful industry training or apprenticeship scheme. My PhD thesis was about Māori trade training during and after World War II, and the absolute success of that scheme was premised around hostels, and it was premised around the matrons and the staff that were in there providing the young trainees with the care and the pastoral guidance that they needed through their time as trainees. You remove this element from our system of training at your peril, in terms of course completions, in terms of people getting the kinds of skills that we need. But, Mr Speaker, the tragedy was for us on the Labour side, and I think the opposition side of the Select Committee benches, it wasn't any great surprise that National were taking this approach to this legislation. It was a disappointment because we saw a real opportunity to do something here. But, Mr Speaker, it was no great surprise because this is the government that scrapped apprenticeships in the 1990s. That there's often that inside shrieks from government members when you talk about how they scrapped apprenticeship training in the 1990s. But, Mr Speaker, it happened, and it took the incoming Labour government of the 1999 in order to reintroduce something and to step up to the plate and to put something in place. This is also a government that has absolutely dragged the chain when it comes to skills training to rebuild Christchurch and to address the housing crisis in Auckland. John Key talked a big game in 2011 before the last election about how we were going to seize the opportunity. We were having skills for Canterbury and there was $42 million put aside and this was going to be dedicated. Mr Speaker, it took this government nearly 2 years to start spending the money. It sat there unused because this was a government that has absolutely no commitment to skills and apprenticeship training. Too little, too late. We're now 3 years into a rebuild where we could have more New Zealanders with the requisite skills and training working in that, and we have lost and squandered that opportunity because this is a government that just does not believe in this as part of what a vibrant future for New Zealand looks like. That money sat there, government members are shaking their head. Well, I'm sorry, the facts are straight. The money sat there and the Minister, Stephen Joyce, claimed that he wasn't going to frog march people into training situations. This is while there was very little effort to get people into those schemes. But, Mr Speaker, we need to think creatively, we need to think differently, and we need to think beyond the narrow, ideologically blinkered piece of legislation that we have on the table before us. I have a members' bill in the ballot that I sincerely hope one day will get drawn, which picks up a piece of Labour Party policy from the last election, which is about using the money that we pay to young people in terms of unemployment benefit, using this as a payment to employers for them to offset some of the cost of taking on more apprentices. But, Mr Speaker, the tragedy is if we'd actually adopted some of these pragmatic and sensible and very, very sensible solutions, we would have more young people 3 years through their training that were able to take a really active part and be part of the clamour for skilled labour in Christchurch that is experiencing at the moment. But, Mr Speaker, this is the kind of lack of thinking, the lack of clarity and the lack of creativity we're seeing in this area. Instead, what we're seeing is a desperate clinging on to the need to privatise yet another bit of our education system, not content with our primary and secondary schools and our polytechnic sector. Now their sights are set very firmly on the industry training sector, Mr Speaker. There are real concerns about this bill. We are very disappointed that government members of the Select Committee didn't take the opportunity to listen to the people that are on the ground, who are involved in industry, who know what it's really like and what is needed out there, but instead clung to their very, very narrow beliefs and have produced a piece of legislation that Labour cannot support because it is to the detriment of apprentice and skills training in this country. And for Labour, skills training and the kinds of commitment we give that are absolutely vital to our future.
I call Colin King.
Mr Speaker.